Good afternoon and welcome. I think this is on, but maybe not. Can you hear me? No. Okay. Let's see. You got it? Okay. Good afternoon and welcome and Happy New Year to all. We have an overflow crowd for a wonderful event, another in our series of the Joe and Alma Gildenhorn Middle East series. They're right in the front row. Joe Gildenhorn chaired our board for 11 wonderful years. And Alma has been a resource here like no other, so I'm delighted to welcome them. I'm also delighted to welcome the Israeli ambassador, Ron Dermer, for a return appearance. I can give you 5 reasons why we love Ron Dermer, but I'll spare you for the moment. And I think we have the ambassadors here from Bulgaria, Timor, and Fiji. We also have a member of the Wilson Cabinet and many of our dear friends, and you're all our dear friends. And an event like this on the Middle East is near and dear to my heart, as I visited the region 25 times as a member of Congress, where I served for 17 years. Many of you know that. And I'm going back to Israel this weekend for the annual meeting of a very impressive national security think tank chaired by former military intelligence chief Amos Yadlin. So today, the main attraction is Dore Gold. We last crossed paths when Prime Minister Netanyahu was in Washington late last year to speak at the Center for American Progress, one of what I call our frenemies, just up the road. By reaching out to Democrats there, he reminded Washington that U.S.-Israel ties run far deeper than partisan politics. But our friend Dore Gold is getting a better deal than his boss did. At the Wilson Center, we offer a one-stop shop for all political perspectives, Republican, Democrat, and everything in between. So welcome, Dore. And let me reiterate our invitation to Prime Minister Netanyahu to visit our one-stop shop when he next comes to Washington. I'll spare you the 5 reasons why he should come. Through our scholars, friends, and alumni, we also bring you ground truth from around the world. And ground truth is something that our moderator today, Aaron Miller, makes certain we do on a basically weekly basis. We hold a telephonic conference with people in hotspots around the world, many of them former scholars and experts from the Wilson Center, and a few people here Aaron typically moderates. We've had over 55 of them, I'd say half of them, touching on the Middle East region. Today we spotlight the view from Israel, an anxious nation confronting a tense neighborhood. The title is Grim, Middle East Meltdown, the view from Israel. I could actually think of 5 reasons why there's some good news in Israel, but as you confront the region, I can think of 5 reasons why there is reason to worry. Among other things, on the border with Lebanon, Hezbollah plots revenge for the strike that killed one of its commanders in Syria. In the streets of Jerusalem, lone wolf actors are grabbing knives, guns, and steering wheels to target civilians. And Iran shows no sign of reining in its illegal missile program. Those are just a few of the variables Israel's leaders have to juggle. And like the United States, Israel is also following the chaos in Syria, the destruction in Yemen, and a dramatic spike in tension between Sunnis and Shia, something that Israel is not responsible for. Confronting that much uncertainty, it's essential that we have a sound strategic framework. And that is something that Dr. Dore Gold is going to, I hope, spell out in remarks. And then following his remarks, Aaron David Miller, who served 6 secretaries of state and is...
Are you sure it wasn't 5?
6, not 5. 6 is not the same magic number, Aaron, but 6 secretaries of state and is our vice president for New Initiatives, will moderate the discussion, and we invite all of you to participate in that discussion. So now, please welcome Aaron Miller.
Jane, thanks so much for that and for everything that you do for the Wilson Center. To the Gildenhorns, our deepest appreciation and love for your generosity and your support for the center over time. To Henri Barkey, our new director of the Middle East program, Henri's extraordinary, and we welcome him to the Wilson Center. And to Ron Dermer, who started this nonsense with 5 points. Thank you very much, Ron. Dore, it's an honor to have you here. We've known each other for many years, and our paths have crossed since Madrid, actually,
Right.
which was a very long time ago. Dore's had a distinguished academic and diplomatic career. Israel's ambassador to the UN, now Director General of the Israeli Foreign Ministry. He's also written an enormous amount and been an analyst of distinction. And even though you and I have not seen eye to eye on all matters, I've always respected and do to this day your honesty and your clarity when it comes to analyzing these matters, and your directness. You have convictions and you assert them. And in the human enterprise, and certainly in Middle East analysis, that's really rare. I think you'd also agree that the Middle East today is probably more fraught than any time that we've seen it. It's complex, it's more dysfunctional, it's angry, it's broken. The word meltdown may not be too much of an exaggeration. I remember one of my former bosses, Jim Baker, as I walked the cable in, suspending our dialogue with the PLO in 1990, literally threw the cable up in the air, and his Texas accent looked at me and said, "Aaron," he said, "in my next life, I want to be a Middle East analyst just like you, because I know I'll be guaranteed a permanent source of employment." And the fact is, I think Baker probably didn't realize, even Jim Baker didn't realize, how permanent that source of employment was going to be. The challenges that my government confronts in the Middle East are immense. Iraq, Syria, implementation of the Iran nuclear deal, recent eruption of tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And we are distant in many respects from the conflict. I'm fond of saying, and I'll say it again, that we are in a unique position geographically. We have non-predatory neighbors to our north and south, and we have what one historian said, I wish it had been me, fish to our east and west, what he described as our liquid assets. This puts us in a unique position, truly unique position. You are not in that position. For good or ill, you are not in that position. I mean, it may not be too much of an exaggeration to suggest that the way we see the Middle East very often is from planet Mars, and the way you see it, because where you stand in life has a great deal to do with where you sit.
We have orchestra seats.
Right, exactly. That's a very good way to put it. And I can think of no one better than to provide Israel's perspective, particularly in this fraught region now, than you, Dore. So the housekeeping is very simple. Dore and I are going to chat for 20 minutes. All cell phones off, please, and then we're going to take your questions. And I would just urge you, rather than to do station identification, I mean, identify yourselves, but please ask a question so we can get in as many as we possibly can. Dore, okay, let's start with the following sort of role play. You've been with the Prime Minister quite a lot. I know he's respected your views over the years, informally and formally. You now have a more formal role at this point in your career. If he called you in and he said to you, Dore, identify for me, I have my own views, the Prime Minister would say, but I want an honest assessment of what you believe are the several, 2, 3, 4, deference to Ron Dermer, 5, core challenges, national security challenges that the state of Israel faces today. How would you prioritize them? And I have a follow-up, of course, which is evident. What would you do about them? So how would you respond to the Prime Minister's question?
Well, let's begin with the most formidable problem. And regardless of what one thinks about the agreement between the P5+1 and Iran, the Iranian challenge remains the number one concern of the state of Israel, not just a national security concern like other national security concerns, but a threat to Israel's very survival. A lot of that goes back to a combination of factors in Iran's outlook. We're not just speaking about a nuclear program, which I could speak about separately, but the fact that Iran remains committed to a core ideological principle that appears in its constitution. That's the export of the Iranian revolution. That has not changed. And while 2015 was a year of negotiations, it was also a year that Iran began consolidating its position in Lebanon, Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, and in all kinds of important naval access areas like Bab el-Mandeb in the Red Sea. They haven't completed that effort, but they were certainly active in that respect. A second area of concern is very close to home, and that is resolving or addressing at least the Palestinian issue. Israel, and the Prime Minister has been clear about this, does not want to be a country which has a minority Jewish position. It's committed to its democratic values. But at the same time, we need to keep Israel a secure Israel. And while the Prime Minister has accepted the principle of a two-state for two peoples resolution to the conflict in his Bar Ilan speech a few years back, Israel in no way has accepted the 1967 lines, what are known as the 49 Armistice lines, as the basis for a division between Israel and a future Palestinian state. We need a defensible border and not the old lines that were never an international demarcation line. So that remains a challenge, and it remains particularly a challenge because I was with the Prime Minister and I followed him closely, and he had made a very serious effort to move forward on the Palestinian issue, and it all came to a head in March 2014 when Secretary Kerry's efforts basically came to an end with the issue of Secretary Kerry's framework agreement being presented to Mahmoud Abbas in the Oval Office, and the Palestinian refusal to pick up the gauntlet, pick up the challenge, which Israel had accepted. Of course, with reservations, which were the rules with which, or through which, or with which we were supposed to proceed. The third issue is more abstract, but it's still extremely important. And that is, basically this year, the last 2 years, we have seen a breakdown in world order. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger has a book called World Order, and it describes the challenges to the Westphalia paradigm that's been with us for a very long time. But in the Middle East, borders established at the end of World War I. I mean, everyone talks about Sykes-Picot. They've all of a sudden discovered it. Have ended. Borders have ended between Syria and Iraq and are challenged. There are whole parts of the Middle East that are areas with no sovereign. No one's in control. And those areas are ideal, perfectly suited for the growth of terrorist organizations. Now, terrorism, when we used to discuss it 20 or 30 years ago, was a kind of problem that some said was tactical in nature, not strategic. Strategic was the movement of great big land armies across the Middle East. But terrorism was supposed to be a minimal problem. The nature of terrorism has changed along with this vacuum which the terrorist organizations are filling. When ISIS defeated 4 divisions of the Iraqi army in early 2014, they operated battalion-level strength. That isn't 3 terrorists with knives in their mouths. That isn't a small unit with Kalashnikov rifles. We're talking about terrorist armies that look like conventional armies. So with them also seeking weapons of mass destruction, the nature of this problem is on a much greater scale than we had thought about before. And it poses an enormous challenge of how you provide an effective framework for international security when everything looks like it's in meltdown. So that's my summary of what I would tell the Prime Minister of Israel are the 3 top issues on his agenda.
All right, so let's drill down just a little. Let's start with number 3. You know, my own analysis is pretty annoyingly negative, but is there really a breakdown of world order? I mean, I thought about this the other day. I mean, the media has persuaded us that we confront a world on fire, and yet when you look at some of the broad trend line, Ebola killed 13,000 people. The Spanish flu in 1919 killed 100 million, which is 3% of the Earth's population in 1919. We don't have world wars anymore. The truth is murders, genocides, Syria notwithstanding, are fewer. There is one large piece of the world, however, that I think that a compelling case can be made that, in fact, there has been a fundamental breakdown of order. And those get to the two issues that you raised. So you've identified Iran, not surprisingly, as the top challenge, and then the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So how, beginning with the first, does a small country of 8 million people with a very dark past living in a very dangerous neighborhood, amidst all this meltdown, confront the issue of a rising challenge? And is the Iranian nuclear agreement, the one that will approach implementation day sometime this month, an agreement, by the way, which the Iranians and the Americans negotiated, but I would argue respectfully, I've had this conversation with Ron Dermer, that Prime Minister Netanyahu had an enormous impact on actually bringing to fruition. It was Netanyahu's pushing of sanctions, his bringing Iran to the world's attention, continuing to press the Obama administration, that frankly facilitated to a certain degree the agreement that we face. Not that he is a fan of that agreement, and I'm not trying to be sarcastic or cute here. But how does Israel deal with the reality that Iran will reap billions of dollars in sanctions relief? It is now open for business with respect to the international community, and it will still retain 10, 15 years from now a very large and relatively sophisticated nuclear infrastructure that would allow it, should it make the decision to weaponize to do so. How does a tiny country deal with this?
Well, one of the facts of the world system that we're facing today, many people like to ask, it's very popular to ask in many different circles, is Israel isolated? Is Israel alone? And frankly, what has happened, partly because of the Iranian threat, is that Israel has a very similar viewpoint. And in fact, I would call it a strategic convergence with many countries in the region. Some of that is very obvious and overt. We have our peace treaties with Jordan, with Egypt, but increasingly with countries I'd rather not specifically mention because that would only create a problem. We have a similarity of views. And I think one of the challenges is for how we can take that similarity of views, that strategic convergence, and convert it to something which is diplomatically meaningful. That, for me, is one of the challenges I face as Director General of the Foreign Ministry of Israel. What that can mean is if we address many of these challenges, like the Iranian challenge, together with our Arab partners, it is possible we can have a greater impact on the discourse in Europe, in the United States, in the Pacific area, than operating just by ourselves. So a country with 8 million people that has important allies in the Middle East just might be able to protect its interests a little bit more effectively than if it was just alone facing this problem. In many respects, the real front line of the Iranian challenge is the line in the Persian Gulf. We're a step removed, even though Iran has made every effort to put itself on our borders. That's with respect to a country with 8 million people, but you had a follow-up.
Well, no, I mean, I guess Israel's a tiny country. You've got the P5+1 concluding an agreement that is designed to last for a decade or more, which it's an arms control agreement. No one ever offered it up as a comprehensive solution to Iran's nuclear program. It's clearly not that. It's an arms control agreement that lasts for a discrete period of time, and its provisions will go into sunset at a certain point. I guess my question is, as you see it, is there any value and or utility in this agreement? The Iranians behave, outside of the four corners of the agreement in ways that I'm not sure the administration ever anticipated they would, or maybe they did anticipate it. But is there any value in this arms control accord, in your judgment?
Well, I don't think it would be useful for me to rehash what we have been speaking about for the last number of months. It's all on the record, our interviews, the points the Prime Minister has made before Congress. So to just go over that again, I'm not sure that would get us anywhere. I'd actually like to add to the agreement something else. Years ago, I was invited by the former Crown Prince of Jordan, Hassan, to a get-together he used to have called Middle East Forum in the Hashemiyah Palace in Amman. I was then fresh, new foreign policy advisor of Prime Minister Netanyahu in 1996. I arrived to this Hashemiyah get-together, and fascinating foreign ministers from Arab countries are there, and as usual, the coffee breaks are more interesting than the sessions. And at one point, as I'm walking out from the meeting, a hand comes on my shoulder and obviously is from a person who wants to talk to me. I turn around, it was Henry Kissinger. And he and I sat on the side, and he says to me, what you need in the Middle East is a code of conduct. So I pretended to know what he was talking about. And I waited till I got home to Jerusalem to pull down all the Kissinger books I had. And I immediately went to the index under C to look for code of conduct. And I didn't find it in any of the 3 volumes that I owned. The next day I met Secretary Kissinger in what's called the aquarium. That's behind the glass doors as you go into the Prime Minister's office, and he was waiting for a meeting with the Prime Minister, which I was going to attend as well. And I admitted the lacuna in my knowledge, my fact that I didn't know what he was talking about, a code of conduct. And so he said, my young man, I will tell you, when I negotiated an arms control agreement in 1971 called SALT I, I faced a problem. I said, well, what was the problem? He said, I recognized that we could, at that time SALT I was a strategic arms limitation treaty. Limitation meant that you were trying to limit the growth of Soviet and American strategic nuclear forces. You weren't pulling them down as you did later on with the START treaties. But in SALT, putting limitations, he recognized that he would come to an agreement with the Soviet Union, and there was a danger that the Soviet Union would remain active in different parts of the Third World. And of course, that was the story of the 1970s in Angola, Mozambique, the Horn of Africa, and eventually the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So he said, I needed to have an understanding that I could use in our relations with the Soviet Union, which was essentially a code of conduct. You adhere to these principles of international behavior. Now, if they adhere to it, we've really created détente. We've really done something. And if they don't adhere to it, then I have basically a club to hit them with in different international meetings, the UN and the media, whatever. And so it was a very evocative idea. And maybe he was talking about terrorism and the PLO. I don't know what the analogy exactly was that he had in mind. But I go back to that conversation at the Hashemiyah Palace and I think about our situation today. You need to have an instrument that can address Iranian adventurism in the Middle East. Their use of proxies to threaten the security of Middle Eastern countries. And basically what we all need as part of disorder in the Middle East and disorder in the world are principles for determining who's inside the tent and who's outside the tent. If you adhere to those international principles, that you don't have to be Henry Kissinger to figure them out, then you've created a new order, some kind of basis for security. And if countries don't adhere to those principles, which are basic principles about combating terrorism and not giving refuge to terrorist movements and countering incitement, et cetera, if you don't agree with those, if a country doesn't agree with those, they're outside the tent. They're not they don't get the benefits of being part of a civilized group of countries. So that's what I would suggest is what's necessary now, and should be a subject that we deal with in our international discussions.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you had a different kind of region filled with coherent, cohesive states, you could aspire to such a code of conduct. But right now, you're not talking about codes of conduct. You're talking about function versus dysfunction. You're talking about 3 Arab states which are just now in the process, Libya, Yemen, and Syria, of fragmentation, and others who are too weak or marginal to make major contributions, and still others that are dysfunctional, Iraq and Egypt, that will face tremendous problems in the years to come. I mean, it's a nice thing to consider. I just wonder whether Middle East realities will allow it. Let me shift the...
Well, let me just add one point
Sure.
to this. In the case of Iran, we're asking ourselves, there are diverse views about Iran, and this is where, gentlemen who are very respectable with different perspectives.
And women can agree and disagree.
And women, yes, can agree to disagree or whatever.
Right.
But the question is what to do with Iran. And unless Iran passes some minimal test in terms of its international behavior, I personally don't see that they should be accorded some special position as a country that should be treated equally among other countries. I think they then define themselves through such an instrument as a real pariah. And they should be tested. That's my simple point. And in order to test them, you have to have fundamental principles to test them with. And that's, I think, the direction we have to go in. Otherwise, we're in danger of facing Iran's impact on the region. Just one other point. In the Washington Post, I think it was in March of 2014, there was an interview with David Petraeus, former head of the CIA and commander of U.S. forces, CENTCOM, and in Iraq itself. And the discussion was over ISIS. And I found it amazing that he was saying that the Shia militias operating in Iraq were a greater danger to the future of Iraq than ISIS. Not that ISIS should be looked at in any positive way. To the contrary, it's one of the most dangerous terrorist organizations. But frankly, the militias supported by Iran were even more dangerous. So we have to have some kind of effective way of evaluating Iran's contribution to international security. And if they're undermining international security, I think that there should not be a problem, and I believe they are undermining international security, for us coming to an agreement about basic principles that allow us to define whose camp they're in.
Let me ask you a question about something I know you've been involved in lately. An argument can be made that the 3 most functional states in the region are the 3 non-Arabs, Israel, Turkey, and Iran. All are stable domestically, all have tremendous economic potential. They have military and intelligence organizations that actually work. One of the three has a very close relationship with the United States. Turkey's a member of NATO. Tell us what you can about the recent improvement in U.S.-Turkish relations.
In U.S.
I'm sorry, Israeli-Turkish relations.
Well, that's an active negotiation that's going on, so that obviously limits
Well, what can you tell us?
my ability to just sort of sit here and
I would never
hold forth
you to
about
do that.
Israeli-Turkish relations.
Sure.
It's an active negotiation that's going on, as I said. We have some well-known, outstanding issues that we need to still resolve. I think there's a convergence there, too, of our strategic interests, which allow both countries to be interested in trying to see how they can bridge their gaps. Whether there's finally the breakthrough that we hope for still remains to be seen, although the rhetoric coming out of Istanbul is decidedly different than what we were hearing for the last number of years. Ankara, excuse me. The Ottoman Empire no longer exists.
Okay, before we get to questions, I want to leave as much time as possible for those. Let me ask you about the U.S.-Israeli relationship. You spent a lot of time analyzing and studying it. I have my own views on it as well. I don't want to talk about the relationship between the current president and Benjamin Netanyahu. I want to ask you the question in a different way. What is the one thing you think that Israelis don't understand about the United States And the one thing that Americans, maybe government officials, don't really get about the state of Israel?
That's the hardest question you've asked. You know, we have a problem. Israelis come to the United States for 2-3 days and return to Israel as experts. And the same is true with Americans who visit Israel. Short little visits and come, oh yeah, I was just in Jerusalem. I talked to everybody. I talked to this one, that one. They usually use the fingers, you know. That doesn't make you an expert on the relationship. The relationship is far deeper than a current conversation. And there is real glue binding these countries.
Right. I mean, let me pose it a different way. I mean, I'll make it even harder for you.
Good.
I mean, all countries pursue policies that are, some of which are not perfect. In fact, some of the policies are quite counterproductive, and they fail. I mean, I am a critic of my own government's policies. I ask Palestinians when I was working this question all the time, what is the one thing that you do or you've done that you would like to do differently, on the rational and logical assumption that no one is perfect, let alone nation states in the way we behave. So let me phrase it a different way. Is there one thing that Israel does that you, or has done, that you would regret, or would you want to alter or vary it as it pertains to your relationship with the United States? I mean, it's not one hand clapping. It's two hands clapping. Both parties are responsible for a functional and working relationship, bound by close mutual shared values. All of that is correct, and I would argue it's enduring. But this question of looking in the mirror is critically important, not just for human beings, but for nations who are very close friends. Now, I don't know, you may not want to, or you may not be able to answer this question, but I'll leave it with you as a thought, because there's plenty from the inside and outside that we have done over the years with respect to our relationship with Israel that I wish we had done differently. And it gets to the notion of understanding who we're dealing with. But I'm sure there's a symmetry here. There usually is in close.
Let me tell you something about being an official. And it's something you know very well, but I'll try and answer your question through this roundabout way.
Good.
For about 5 years, I spent time in a track 2 dialogue with individuals who were very close with Mahmoud Abbas in Rome. And one of the things I learned when you're in track 2 and you're not committed to an official line is that you get to think out of the box. I know that's an overworn expression. Think out of the box. It's a great way of covering up for bad thinking. You know, you say, well, at least I'm thinking out of the box. But frankly, sometimes that's what you have to do. And sometimes ideas come from unexpected places. And I think both of us have to have a dialogue that allows us to do that. Because sometimes old ideas just don't work. And if you go back and revisit the same idea, the same approach, because it's inherited from government to government, administration to administration, that locks you in. So I think we have to find a capacity to have that discussion. Sometimes you get officials who miss the old days, that they were in the back channel, precisely for that reason. And I think both of us need to have that perspective.
There's a lot there, actually, on which to build. Okay, questions? I see Jane Harman's hand up.
Well, I thought that was fascinating, especially the last exchange. So in that spirit, my question is there an out-of-the-box way to have a new conversation about settlements?
Well, I was actually going for the bigger issue, which is how to resolve this whole thing, and settlements are a clause in the issues that are part of any final status deal. I do think that sometimes the issue has been overstated, and you see that in interviews with Mahmoud Abbas, for example. There is an amazing interview that he gave to Bernard Avishai a few years back in the New York Times Magazine, and you could actually Google Bernard Avishai, Mahmoud Abbas, and find this article. And in it, Mahmoud Abbas makes a statement. He says, you know, I was willing to give Olmert 1.9% of the West Bank, and the settlements only take up 1.2%. Now, I think actually Mahmoud Abbas's numbers are off. But it doesn't matter. That's what he thought, and that's what he said. So if that's all you're talking about, from his perspective, then if you add, you know, a new row of houses in Ma'ale Adumim, what are we talking about? Are we talking about some substantial change in the geographic situation in the West Bank? Certainly not, from what he said. So I think somehow that issue has been a bit overstated. It's a point of vulnerability for Israel, because Israel's perspective on settlements, from a legal standpoint, from the standpoint of the Israeli Supreme Court, is one in which this is something which is Israel's legal right for Israelis who want to voluntarily live there, and it's not a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. But that isn't widely supported in the international community, so if we have a disadvantage, it's something which we pay a price for. But I think the stress in our rethinking and trying to put up new ideas and thinking out of the box has to be our overall approach to resolving the conflict. And settlements are one clause in it, and not the most important clause.
Yes, 4 or 5 rows back.
Is that me?
Yes, it is.
I'm Tom Getman. I'm an NGO executive, and I've served in the Middle East. The Economist today, which you may have seen, commends the Israeli government for cracking down on Israeli extremists, especially from settlements, to segue. And I'm just wondering if that was something you had a hand in, and how you see it in light of the fact that the article also talks about the fact that at the same time, extremists are encouraged. And those of us that travel a lot have seen people who are provocateurs on the Temple Mount, surrounded by soldiers and police, and they're attacking people at the Al-Aqsa Mosque and so on. So how do the two fit together? And will there be more bringing back of that kind of provocation?
So let me first of all clarify, I'm the Director General of the Foreign Ministry. I'm not from the Justice Ministry of Israel. And there's obviously a big difference. You're asking a question that the Attorney General's office would answer in this country, and not the U.S. Department of State, because they're different jurisdictions of subjects. I think you've, frankly, from my view, mixed subjects that are completely separate. Those Israeli extremists who were arrested engaged in the murder of Palestinians, and they should be arrested, face trial, and there's just no question about it. The Temple Mount's a much more difficult subject, but basically the question there is who is violating the status quo as it was understood for many years in that area. The status quo only allows Muslim prayer on the Temple Mount. It allows Jews and Christians to visit the Temple Mount, but does not allow them to engage in organized prayer on the Temple Mount. There have been lots of Israelis who come on the Temple Mount, and that's a right which should be preserved. I personally don't go to the Temple Mount because I'm sort of a politically conservative on the question of Jewish prayer up there, or even visiting up there. And I don't want to get into the whole long technical Jewish religious details on that. But there is a right that's recognized and it has to be protected by our police. Right now, the provocations on the Temple Mount, I'll tell you exactly where they came from. They came from the northern branch of the Islamic movement in Israel under Sheikh Raed Salah, who pulled out this phony argument, which goes back to the days of the Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, which accuses the Jews of seeking to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque or undermining it in some way. And that is just completely untrue, no basis for that accusation. But that accusation led many followers of his movement to come onto the Temple Mount and attack Israelis or throw rocks on the plaza of the Western Wall.
Excuse me, I saw Israelis attacking ladies at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, surrounded by IDF and police. I'm not talking about...
Well, if somebody engaged in activity of attacking anybody on the Temple Mount, that is against the law, and they should be dealt with. But our primary problem, frankly, comes from this source, which is why we've taken measures against the northern branch of the Islamic movement, which is essentially, by the way, a derivative of the Muslim Brotherhood in Israel. But our ideal should be that the Temple Mount become a place where members of all faiths can visit, although Muslims are the only ones who can pray up there. I look at other religious sites around the world. I go to St. Peter's in Rome. Somebody say I can't walk into St. Peter's because I'm Jewish? Or is only Catholics can walk in? No. We need to have a principle of religious freedom which is defended and the security of all religions in Jerusalem. And that's something which the government of Israel is committed to.
Yes, in the middle, in red sweater.
Yes, when you were asked the question about Steve Sherman, our attorney in town. Okay, hi, Steve Sherman. When you were asked the question regarding strategic concerns of Israel, you didn't mention ISIS. If ISIS were to threaten the stability of Jordan, would that change your answer? And what do you see the likelihood of any Jordan's stability in light of ISIS' expansion?
Look, the number of strategic challenges to Israel are not 3. They're not even 5. They're at least 10 and maybe more. And ISIS is a direct threat to Israel. There's no question about it. Let me just let you know or share with you the fact that not only is ISIS moving towards Israel in the north, inside of Syria, as it comes down from northern Syria towards the Golan Heights, ISIS is a problem for us on our southern border. There was a radical Islamic movement called Ansar Beit al-Maqdis in Sinai, in northern Sinai, made up of Bedouin tribes who became jihadists. And in the last 2 years, they have declared their loyalty to the caliph of ISIS, known as Mr. Baghdadi, and they are now a part of ISIS. They are not only operating in northern Sinai against the Egyptian army, they have now made common cause with Hamas. And Hamas operatives visit them and work out different avenues of cooperation, including providing medical relief to wounded jihadi operatives from ISIS inside of the Gaza Strip, financial help, and weapons transfers. So ISIS is already, from our standpoint, involved in some of our more important security issues. And I would have mentioned it, but I took the 3 most prevalent that I think are the most urgent matters we have to deal with. But ISIS is a real problem and perceived as in Israel as a problem. Now, of course, if you compare ISIS to Iran, let's take an issue, a comparison that would be reflected in the media. General Petraeus put the Iranian militias in Iraq as a higher order threat than ISIS in the Iraqi context. And in our context, Iran, which is a country of 80-some million people, which is seeking to get nuclear weapons, and I should commend the International Atomic Energy Agency for its report on, in one respect, with its report on the possible military dimensions of the Iranian program, for acknowledging that Iran was seeking nuclear weapons. This wasn't something we made up. It's now been acknowledged. So you have a country seeking to get nuclear weapons, much larger, supporting radical Islam of the Shiite version as opposed to the Sunni version. That for us is a much greater threat than ISIS, although ISIS is a serious problem.
We have a question from the overflow room. The Daily Beast wrote today, reported on an article that the Russians are supplying military equipment to Hezbollah. Would you care to comment?
No, only in our discussion with the Russians, we have made very clear that the supply of advanced weaponry to Hezbollah, chiefly by Iran, is a serious problem for Israel and puts our vital interests at risk.
Okay, in the middle, gray jacket. Sorry.
It's İlhan Tanır from Turkish Press. Ambassador Gold, my question on Syria, and a couple years ago, Turkey and Israel seemed to be on the same side, wishing to see Assad is gone, and I am wondering if you think you're still on the same side with Turkey on Syria, and if you could also kind of talk about what would be the couple of top interests areas with Turkey would be beneficial for two countries if the relations are mended. Thank you.
Well, with respect to the internal situation in Syria, if I didn't make it clear before, I'll make it clear now. We have been very careful not to intervene in the Syrian civil war, except if certain vital Israeli interests are affected, such as the transfer, as I said before, of advanced weaponry to Hezbollah by Iran or by anybody else. But we also have had a humanitarian interest. We cannot ignore the suffering of people in areas near our border. And therefore, Israel opened up a field hospital in the Golan Heights to take care of Syrian refugees who needed urgent medical help. We also opened up our hospitals in the northern part of Israel as part of that effort. But we're not getting drawn into the question of who should replace Assad or how a future Syrian government may be selected. That is not something which we want to be pulled into. As far as Turkey goes, both of us have an interest that Syria not be used as a base for threatening our vital interests. But I wouldn't think it would be useful for me to go into any further detail beyond that.
Well, let me push on that, though. How would you respond to the following question? Is Assad part of the problem, and or should he be included, in your view, in some way as in the solution?
If you take the position that the government of Israel has taken the last number of years, that we are not going to intervene in the Syrian civil war, it is not useful for us to start commenting on the relative merits of different leaders or organizations inside of Syria. We have to protect what are the vital interests of Israel and not get pulled in endlessly into this conflict.
Right, but if I were to ask you whether you want the black flag of ISIS flying over Damascus, you would probably say no.
Well, if I told you I didn't want to be afflicted with cancer, it wouldn't mean that I would be an advocate for heart attacks.
No, I think you answered the question. Okay, way in the back, on the right side, sorry.
Tanyel Kushakjian from the Armenian Assembly of America. I first want to express condolences on the passing of Yossi Sari last year. I know he worked very closely with the Armenian government for many issues, particularly Israel's acknowledgement of the Armenian genocide. Recently, a delegation of the Knesset visited Armenia for parliamentary consultations, and I would like to hear your comments on that. And would you consider Israel's normalization of relations with Turkey as a zero-sum game vis-a-vis Armenia? Thank you.
All I can say is I think that if Armenia and Turkey find a way of mutually addressing the issues of what happened in World War I, that would probably be the best way for many countries who have interests and concerns with both countries. It would put all of us in a much stronger position for addressing your concerns, Turkey's interests, and also the objective international humanitarian issue that emanated out of what happened in World War I. That's the best I can do for you right now. I know there has been a discussion between Armenia and Turkey over this very issue. And I think allowing that discussion to go forward would be very important for everybody.
Here on the right, in the white shirt and tie.
Hi, Steve Swingler, Indiana University. Two-part question about Syria. First, what does Israel make of the Russian intervention in Syria? Is it positive, negative, something else? And then also, people talk about Iran in Syria, but what is the Iranian strategic endgame with their involvement inside Syria? Thank you.
Those are two excellent questions, and let me try to answer them. With respect to the Russian intervention, Russia feels it has certain vital interests, but you should speak to somebody from the Russian Foreign Ministry or the Russian Embassy to discuss that. We're aware of what those interests are, and we talk to the Russians. We explain what are our concerns in Syria. They explain what are their concerns in Syria, and we're also trying to make sure that as we each are protecting our own interests, we don't find ourselves we don't find ourselves pulled into any kind of unintended military conflict. That's why this word, which I hadn't heard until this year, deconfliction, is the bottom line of the Israeli-Russian dialogue today, making sure that doesn't occur. Your second question is very important for people to understand. I firmly believe that Iran wants to turn Syria into a province of Iran. And there's a lot of proof of that in terms of Iranian behavior. There are statements by a religious leader very close to Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who spoke about spoke about Syria as the 35th province of the Iranian state. But there's a lot more evidence of this than just the particular statement by a religious figure. We have here one of the people who came in my team, the chief of staff of the foreign minister, who is also the prime minister, General Dr. Shimon Shapira, one of our leading expert, I think, in the state of Israel on Hezbollah and Iranian intervention in the Levant. And Shimon pointed out to me the role of Iran in spreading Shia Islam inside of Syria. If you're just there for a military relationship, then all you do is, build a few bases, train a few soldiers, and that's it. But if you're involved in creating a social and political change in Syria that incorporates Syria ultimately into the Iranian state, then part of the Iranian modus operandi is actually converting Sunni Muslims into Shiites. And that's what they're doing in Syria. So I think we have to be very cautious about this. I can tell you this, that at the end of the day, if Iran is able to incorporate Syria into the Iranian state, that is something which operates against Israel's most vital security interests. Because it's not just a question of Shiite mosques in Syria. It's a question of creating the infrastructure for a permanent Syrian military deployment against Israel from the north. And that's something which we cannot accept.
I think we can have time for two more questions. Yes.
Thank you very much. Benjamin Tu, a retired diplomat. You mentioned that the U.S.-Israeli relationship is broad and deep. Although it may be fraying a bit, the same cannot be said about the Western European-Israeli relationship, which seems to be deteriorating. What can the sides do to reverse this process? What are the prospects?
First of all, let me present the relationship with Europe as a much more as a mixed situation. It isn't so clearly a relationship that is moving in a purely negative direction. A few years back, Israel was invited to take part in an initiative called Horizon 2020, which was a joint R&D program in which Israel puts in close to 50% of the funds for joint R&D, and the European Union puts in close to 50%. It might be 55 on their side and 45 on our side. I don't remember the exact numbers, but that's roughly what it is. And what is this R&D program all about? Europe felt a few years back that it needed to make its industries more competitive in the world economy in the future. And they looked around the world and they said, you know, if we pull together our European resources, we can have a good shot at achieving this goal. And then they looked beyond Europe, beyond the borders of the European Union, and there was one country they thought that should be part of this Horizon program, and it was Israel. Now, of course, once that happened, the question arose, well, what happens if there is an R&D lab in a West Bank settlement, in a part of Jerusalem that isn't recognized by Europe as part of Israeli Jerusalem? Can that be part of the Horizon 2020 program? And we got into a huge struggle over that question. So you can look at the struggle and say, Israeli-European relations are really in deep trouble. Or you can look at the invitation of the Europeans for Israel to join an R&D program important for the future of the European economies. So, you know, is it half full, half empty? I find when I visit Europeans, whether European Union officials or officials from the member states, there's a strong desire for preserving good relations with Israel. At the same time, admittedly, we have our differences. And as with everything in Israel, the differences become the news. But it would be a mischaracterization of our relationship with Europe to say that it's all bad news.
All right, one more question, quickly. Yes, here.
My name is Stephen Shore. Does Israel have any possible interest in joining NATO?
Well, I'll just be very brief about this. The national security doctrine of Israel since the days of our first Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion is that Israel should protect itself by itself. We seek allies. We seek to cooperate extensively with a number of European countries that are members of NATO, as we seek to cooperate with the United States. And, but if your question has within it a suggestion that Israel will put its security interests or the priorities of its security thinking in the NATO alliance, well, we like to cooperate with NATO. It's ultimately Israel will provide the security. It will provide for its own security through the IDF rather than through an external alliance like NATO.
Dore, thank you. Please join in thanking Dore Gold for a fascinating presentation. Dore, thank you.
If everyone could kindly stay in their seats for a minute, please. Thank you.